Good morning, guys. So today we are starting our discussion related to Spring Boot and microservices, right? Spring Boot and microservices. We are already having Spring Framework. We are already having Spring Framework. So what is that Spring? Spring is an application development framework. Spring is an application development framework. By using Spring Framework, we can develop below types of applications. So by using Spring, we can develop standalone applications. We can develop standalone applications. We can develop web applications by using Spring. We can develop distributed applications by using Spring. Standalone applications, web applications, and distributed applications we can develop by using Spring. Spring is called as application development framework. We can develop below types of applications by using Spring, like standalone applications, web applications, and distributed applications. Spring framework developed in modular fashion. Spring framework developed in modular fashion. Right? Spring framework came into market in 2003. The first production release happened in the 2004. The current version of the Spring framework is 5.x. The current version of Spring is 5.x. Right. So this is all about Spring. Spring is a framework that is called as application development framework. By using that Spring framework, we can develop several types of applications. Spring framework developed in modular fashion. Spring framework released into market in the year of 2004. The current version of the Spring framework is 5.x version. When the Spring is already available, why Spring Boot came into market? Right. In the Spring, there are several advantages are available. Spring is non-invasive framework. Spring is non-invasive framework. Spring is versatile framework. Spring is non-invasive. Spring is versatile framework. Versatile framework, like that, there are so many advantages are available. Note, in Spring framework, programmer is responsible to take care of configurations. So whenever we are developing an application, along with the Java code, some configurations are required. When we are developing an application, only Java code is not sufficient to complete the project. Only Java code is not sufficient to complete the project. Along with the Java code, we need to write some configurations also. That is one of the challenge, or we can say a drawback available in the Spring framework. Spring is having so many advantages. So it is a non-invasive framework. That means it will not force you to use any framework classes or interfaces. To develop your classes loosely coupling, Spring is not forcing to use any classes or interfaces from the framework. Spring is called as non-invasive framework. And Spring is versatile framework. Spring is versatile, nothing but Spring framework can be integrated with any other framework available in the market. Spring is versatile, that means it can be integrated with any other framework available in the Java, in any other Java framework available in the market. Spring can be integrated with that. Spring will not force you to use any classes or interfaces from the framework, because if you use any classes or interfaces from the framework, then your project will be tightly coupled with that framework. So to avoid that problem, Spring is not forcing to use any framework related classes or interfaces, non-invasive. So when these many advantages are available, is there any drawback available in the Spring framework? Yes, there is one drawback in the Spring, or I can say challenging thing in the Spring. Programmer is responsible when we develop application by using Spring. When we develop application by using Spring, when we develop application by using Spring, programmer is responsible to take care of configurations required for the application. Now it is not about one project, guys. In every project we need to do the configurations, which classes are belongs to web components, which classes are belongs to business components, which classes are belongs to persistent components, how to perform the dependency injections, right? How to perform the dependency injections, how to get the database connection, how to get the database connection. All these configurations we need to take care as a programmer. That is one of the challenging thing available in the Spring framework. When we develop a project, so when we are developing a project now, as we discussed, uh, a project will contain several classes. A project will contain several classes. Some classes are called as controllers. Some classes are called as service classes. Controller classes will be available. Service classes will be available. Some classes are DAO classes will be available. DAO classes will be available. For this, for these controller classes, we need to write one config file. We need to write one config file to represent controller classes. And to represent service classes, we need to write one more configuration file. To represent the DAO classes, we need to write one configuration file. So like this, along with the Java classes, we need to take care of the configurations required for our application. Programmer is responsible to manage these configurations. Programmer is responsible to manage these configurations which are required. So configurations are common in every project. Now, in your company, if 100 projects are getting developed, in all those 100 projects, you need to write the configuration. So configuration is very important for every project. Configuration is very important for every project. So we have created a project with several classes, right? So what is the role of those classes in the project? Whether those classes are communicating with the database, whether those classes are executing the business logic, whether those classes are responsible to deal with request and response. What is the purpose of that class? Who will create the object for that class? Who will perform dependency injection for that class? How dependency injection should be performed for those classes? Everything you need to represent as a configuration. Everything you need to represent as a configuration. In the project, 1000 classes are available. These 100 classes are belongs to controllers. These 200 classes are belongs to service layer. These 500 classes are belongs to DAO. This class object should be injected into this class. Dependency injection should be performed. Setter injection should be performed. Constructor injection should be performed. Like that, we need to take care of configurations. As a programmer, we are responsible to take care of the configurations required for the application. After few years, after few years, Spring team realized that in every project, configurations are required. For every project, realized that for every project, configurations are required. Every programmer dealing with the configurations every programmer dealing with configurations in the project. Every programmer dealing with the configurations in the project. The configurations are common in the projects. The configurations are common in the project. Now, so that Spring framework also identified that so many people are using the Spring framework to develop the project. So suppose if 10 companies are using this Spring, in 10 companies, they have to take care of the configurations. It is a common requirement. It is a common requirement. Everybody should take care of the configurations required for the project. Now, they got a question. Spring people, the company who developed this Spring framework, they got a question. Array, people are using Spring. Our Spring framework is becoming more popular in the market. So many companies, so many developers are using our Spring framework to develop the project. But one thing is common. Every programmer is dealing with the configuration. Why can't we provide the configuration along with the Spring so that they can focus only on the development part? They can focus only on the business logic part instead of configurations. Why can't we automate the configurations required for the applications which are developing by using Spring framework? That is the idea that Spring team got. With that idea, Spring Boot came into market. So already Spring framework is available. Spring is called as application development framework. Application development framework, nothing but we can develop one application end to end by using Spring framework. One complete project can be developed by using Spring framework. Several types of applications we can develop by using Spring framework. A standalone application can be developed by using Spring. A web application can be developed by using Spring. A distributed application can be developed by using Spring. Spring framework developed in modular fashion. This Spring came into market in the year of 2004. There are several modules available in the Spring, like a core module, context module, AOP module, DAO module, ORM module, right? WebMVC module, security, like that. There are several modules available. So the current version of the Spring is 5.x version, and there are some advantages with the Spring. Spring is a non-invasive framework. Spring is a versatile framework. Non-invasive means it will not force you to use framework related classes and interfaces. Versatile framework means this Spring can be integrated with any other Java frameworks like Hibernate. We can integrate Spring with Hibernate. We can integrate Spring with struts, right? Like that, there are several frameworks in the Java. With all those frameworks, our Spring framework can be integrated, right? So there are several advantages of using Spring. But when you are developing a project, if you just write the Java code, can we execute that project? No. Only Java code is not sufficient to run the project. Along with the Java classes, along with the Java code, we need to take care of configurations required for the application. So configurations are for only specific project, or configurations are common in every project? Configurations are applicable only for a specific project, or configurations are common for every project? Configurations are common for every project. So when we are developing a project, we need to develop the business logic, and we need to take care of the configurations required for our application. When we are developing a project, we need to take care of the business logic, and we need to take care of the configurations. Configurations are common for every project. Now, to overcome the configurations required for the project, Spring team released Spring Boot to overcome configurations, to overcome configuration problem. Spring team released Spring Boot into market to overcome configuration problems. To overcome common configuration problems, Spring team released Spring Boot into market. What is this Spring Boot? What is this Spring Boot? Already Spring framework is available. Then why Spring Boot came into market? Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring based applications. Whatever the project you want to develop, that project you can develop by using Spring framework. Whatever the project you want to develop, you can develop by using Spring framework. What is Spring Boot? It is another approach. It is another approach to develop Spring based applications. If you want to develop one web application, you can develop that web application by using Spring framework. If you develop the project by using Spring framework, you are responsible to take care of configurations. If you want to develop one web application, your web application will contain some controller classes, some service classes, some DAO classes, some data source configuration, SMTP configuration, security configuration. Like that, we need to take care of several configurations in the application. So to overcome the configurations problem in the project, Spring people, the company who developed Spring framework, they only released Spring Boot into market. So what is this Spring Boot? Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring based applications with less configurations. It is another approach to develop Spring based applications with less configuration. Spring Boot is an enhancement of Spring framework. Spring Boot is an enhancement. Spring Boot is an enhancement of Spring framework. Spring framework. What we can do, what type of applications we can develop by using Spring, same type of applications can be developed by using Spring Boot also. Spring Boot internally uses Spring framework. Spring Boot internally uses Spring framework. What type of applications? What type of applications we can develop using Spring framework? Using Spring framework, same application, same type of applications can be developed by using Spring Boot also. Can be developed by using Spring Boot also. That means whatever you can do by using Spring, same thing can be done by Spring Boot also. Sir, by using Spring, I can develop a standalone application, I can develop a web application, and I can develop a distributed application. By using Spring Boot, what I can do? By using Spring Boot also, you can develop all these three types of applications. By using Spring, I can develop them. By using Spring Boot also, I can develop them. Then what is the difference? Then what is the difference? If you develop a project by using Spring, then you are responsible to take care of configurations required for the project. If you develop a project by using Spring framework, then you are responsible to take care of configurations required for the project. When you go for Spring Boot will take care of the configurations. Spring Boot is one approach. Spring Boot is just another approach to develop a Spring application. So now, if you want to develop a project, if you want to develop one application, suppose for example, I want to develop one web application, guys. I want to develop one web application. You can develop this web application in two ways. You can develop this web application in two ways. Okay. One approach is you can develop this project by using Spring framework. You can use Spring framework to develop this application. You can use Spring framework to develop this application. If you use the Spring framework to develop this application, you need to create Java classes and you need to take care of configurations. That means you need to take care of your business logic. Business logic we are going to write. Business logic you have to write, and configurations also you have to write for your project when you develop this by using Spring framework. When you develop this by using Spring framework, this is approach one to develop the project. Approach one to develop the project. We have another approach to develop the same application. We can develop the same application by using another approach that is called Spring Boot. That is called Spring Boot. Here, you need to focus only on your business logic. You need to focus only on your business logic because configurations will be taken care by Spring Boot. So whatever the project you want to develop, that project you can develop by using Spring framework, and you can develop that by using Spring Boot also. If you develop the project by using Spring framework, then you need to take care of the business logic and the configurations required for your project. If you use Spring Boot to develop that project, then you need to take care of only business logic because configurations will be taken care by Spring Boot. Now, sir, if I am going to use Spring Boot, can I say that Spring Boot is a replacement for the Spring framework? No, Spring Boot is not the replacement for Spring framework, guys. Spring Boot is enhancement of the Spring framework. Spring Boot is just a part of the Spring. Now, here our application will be available. Our application will be available. Our application will talk with the Spring Boot. Spring Boot will talk with the Spring framework internally. That Spring framework will talk with the J2EE internally. Java J2EE. Java J2EE. Our application is going to communicate with the Spring framework. Whatever the project that we are developing, our application is available. Our application will communicate with the Spring Boot. Spring Boot will internally communicate with the Spring framework. Spring framework will internally communicate with Java and J2EE. This is how the communication is going to happen. So with this, can we say that Spring Boot is a replacement of the Spring framework, or Spring Boot is enhancement of the Spring framework? Guys, Spring Boot is a replacement for the Spring. So if I know Spring Boot, that means I no need to learn the Spring. I will not use the Spring in my project. I will use only Spring Boot. Can we say that Spring Boot is replacement of the Spring, or Spring Boot is enhancement of the Spring? Spring Boot is enhancement of the Spring. Spring Boot is just one approach to develop Spring applications with less configurations. Spring Boot is another approach to develop Spring applications. Are you clear with my point? So now, if you want to develop a project by using Spring, how many options we have? If we want to develop the application by using Spring, how many options we have? 2 options we have. What are those 2 options to develop a Spring application by using Spring framework? One is by using only Spring framework. Second one is by using Spring Boot. What is the problem if you develop a project by using only Spring framework? What is the problem if we develop a project by using only Spring? As a programmer, we need to take care of the business logic in the application, and we need to take care of configurations also required for our application. If I use a Spring Boot, then we need to take care of only business logic because configurations will be taken care by Spring Boot. Spring Boot is intelligent to understand the configurations required for the project, and the Spring Boot will provide those configurations for our projects. We need to focus only on the business logic. So when we use a Spring Boot to develop our application, we will focus only on the business logic. Our application will communicate with the Spring Boot. Spring Boot will internally communicate with the Spring framework. Spring framework will internally communicate with Java and J2EE. All right. So what is the Spring Boot? Spring Boot is another approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. Spring Boot is an enhancement of the Spring framework. Spring Boot internally uses Spring framework only. We cannot say Boot is replacement for the Spring. It is internally using Spring framework only. What type of applications we can develop using Spring framework? Same type of applications can be developed by using Spring Boot also. All right. Now, if you summarize, what is this Spring Boot? Spring Boot is equal to Spring framework minus XML configurations. Spring Boot means Spring framework minus XML configurations. So whatever the configurations are required, you no need to do that. It will use the Spring, but you no need to do the configurations. Boot is going to take care of the configurations. So Spring Boot definition you people understood. Can all of you respond to me? What is the Spring Boot? I want response from you guys. Respond in the chat box. What is the Spring Boot? Please be active, don't sleep. The classes are very important. Without having a knowledge on the Spring Boot, it is difficult to get the job in the industry as a Java developer. Spring Boot is mandatory. Spring Boot is mandatory. Whether you are a fresher or whether you are a experienced, you should know the Spring Boot and microservices. That is a trend in the market now. So what is the Spring Boot? Spring Boot is another approach to develop Spring applications. What type of applications we can create by using Spring framework? Same type of applications we can develop by using Boot also. Boot is another approach to develop Spring applications with less configurations. Boot is an enhancement for Spring framework. Boot internally using Spring framework only. All right. Now, so Spring Boot is available to develop the applications. What are the advantages of the Spring Boot? Spring Boot advantages. If I go with Spring Boot, what are the benefits we are going to get? What are the advantages we are going to get? The first advantage, the first and foremost advantage we need to talk about the Spring Boot is auto configuration. Spring Boot, the main advantage why Spring Boot became this much popular in the market. Why Spring Boot became this much popular in the market? The first advantage of the Spring Boot is auto configuration. Auto configuration means Boot will take care of the configurations which are required for our applications. Auto configuration means Spring Boot will take care of configurations required for the project. For example, my application want to communicate with a database. Boot will take care of creating connections with the database. For example, my application wants to deploy, I want to deploy my application in the server. Spring Boot will take care of the server deployment also. So generally when you develop a web application, you need to download the server, you need to install the server, and you need to run your application. Now, let me show you one simple proof, guys. So I'm not asking you to understand the code, what I'm going to do here. Just I will show you how simply we can develop one web application by using Spring Boot. You no need to download the server to run the web application. You no need to install the server to run the web application when you go for Spring Boot, because Spring Boot came into market with a concept called auto configuration. Auto configuration means Boot is acting as an intelligent. Boot will identify what configuration required for the project. It will provide that configuration. Now you see, just observe, guys. File, new, Spring Starter project. I'm creating one Boot application. I'm creating simply one Spring Boot web application. I'm going to create Spring Boot web application. I'm going to create. You don't need to understand what is the code we are writing. Just I'm going to select one web starter. If you want to develop a web application, there is a web starter. dependency. I'm adding web starter web dependency. I have created my application. I have created my application. I'm not installing any server. I'm not downloading any server. Just I have created one web application. Let's run this application. Run as boot application. I have just created a project and I am running this project. I have just created the project and I am running this project. See what are the things that will happen in this application. Can you see here? Root web application, Spring Boot application started. Tomcat also started with port number 8080. Root web application context initialized, that means IOC container also created. Tomcat started with the port number 8080. Did I inform to Spring Boot to start the Tomcat server? Did I inform the Spring Boot to start the IOC container? Or is it doing that automatically? Why it is doing that? Why it is doing that? Why it is starting IOC container? Why it is starting a Tomcat? When you develop a project, we need to take care of dependency injections. To perform the dependency injection, IOC container required. In the Spring framework, we need to start the IOC container manually. Bin factory is equal to new XML bin factory. Application context is equal to new class path XML application context. Programmers are responsible to start the IOC container in the Spring. But when it comes to the Spring Boot, automatically the IOC container also started, because it is understanding that it is acting as a intelligent. This person developed a Spring Boot application. So Spring Boot application means the configurations I have to take care. I need to start the IOC container to manage the dependency injections. Spring Boot started IOC container. And in this project, I have used web starter. Web starter means this programmer is creating a web application. This programmer is developing a web application. So when you want to develop a web application, to run this web application, we need a server. Then Tomcat server, it started automatically. Can I say it is auto configuration concept? Starting the IOC container, starting a Tomcat server. When we, am I doing anything here? Am I doing anything here? I just created a project in front of you. I just created a project in front of you. Within 30 seconds of time, I have created my project web application. For example, if you want to develop this web application by using servlets, now let me show you once again how quickly we can develop one application by using Spring Boot. How quickly we can develop one application by using Spring Boot. Okay. Now, just see, I'm going to create the project once again, guys. Observe carefully. File, new, starter project. File, new, starter project. Next, I'm just selecting one dependency called web dependency. Why we are selecting this web dependency? To inform to that I am developing a web application. To inform the Spring Boot I am developing a web application, I am selecting a web starter. Starter nothing but a Maven dependency. Finish. Finish. I have created one web application. I have created one web application. If I run this web application, automatically IOC container created. Automatically Tomcat is started. As a programmer, am I doing any configurations to start the IOC container? As a programmer, am I doing anything to start the IOC container? As a programmer, am I doing anything to start the Tomcat server? I am not doing anything. Now, I want to develop one REST controller. I want to develop one REST controller. Now, see here. In this boot application, I will use one annotation called @REST controller. I want to develop one REST API, REST controller. Here, I'm going to write one method, public string welcome. Public string welcome. Return welcome to AhokIT. Welcome to AhokIT. This one I'm going to map to I'm going to map this to a URL pattern called slash. URL pattern called slash. Now I created a boot application by using web starter. I used one annotation called REST controller. I used one method get mapping. That's it. Now let's stop this project, start it again, run as boot application. I just made some changes to the code. One REST controller annotation I have used, one method I have created. That is my business logic. Now go to browser, go to the browser, localhost colon 8080 slash. Are we able to access our REST controller? Am I able to develop a web application? How much time it is taking to develop a web application by using this Spring Boot? Now, in this approach, I am concentrating only on the business logic. I'm concentrating on the configuration also. I'm concentrating only on the business logic. I'm concentrating on the configurations also. I'm concentrating only on the business logic only. Configurations are taken care by Spring Boot. So how the object is created for this class, how this server started, how this project is deployed into the server, where is the configuration to run our application, nothing we need to know. We no need to know. That thing is taken care by Spring Boot. That is the meaning of auto configuration. Auto configuration means Spring Boot is going to act as a intelligent. Spring Boot will understand what configuration is required for our project. It will provide that configuration for our project. Now for every project, whenever we develop a project, we need IOC container for the project to manage the dependencies. When we develop a web application, it needs to deploy the web application to a server, so it needs to start the server also. I no need to tell those informations to the Spring Boot. It is intelligent. It is intelligent. Based on our project, it will understand what configuration is required and it will provide that configuration. It will provide that configuration. Okay, so you don't need to understand the code, guys. I just gave you a demo to show you how quickly we can develop a project by using Spring Boot. Sir, what is the REST controller? What is get mapping? What is the slash? Don't worry about it. That we will discuss in the web application development. When we are going to learn Spring Web MVC module, then I will give you clarity on what is this REST controller, what is this get mapping, what is this slash and all. So understanding the code is not important today. So you need to understand how quickly we are able to develop one web application by using Spring Boot. Where is the configuration for that project? Programmer is focusing only on the business logic. Configurations taken care by Spring Boot. So configurations, we are writing Spring Boot is taking care of the configurations. Spring Boot is taking care of the configurations. That concept is called as auto configuration. That concept is called as auto configuration. This is one advantage. Now, second advantage. Guys, before going to second advantage, do you have any question related to auto configuration? Are you getting any doubts? You should get one doubt. You should get one doubt. Sir, how the boot will understand what configuration required for us? How boot will understand what configuration required for us? How it will guess what configuration required? That's where POM starters comes into picture. What is that? POM starters. So we have a pom.xml file. I have selected a web dependency, right? I have selected a web dependency. That means it added one web starter. Web starter, nothing but it is used to develop a web application. So whatever the starters you select, based on the starters, it is going to guess the configuration. If you select JDBC starter, that means a connection should be established with the database. Okay. If you select a web starter, that means a server should be started. If you select email starter, then SMTP connection is required. Like this, based on starters available in the form.xml, boot will identify the configuration and it will take care of that configuration. The process of identifying and taking care of the configurations is called as auto configuration in the Spring Boot. And the third advantage is embedded servers. Embedded servers. So to develop a web application, do we need to download and install the servers? To develop a web application, do we need to download and set up the server? Now you have seen just now, within 30 seconds of time, I'm able to create one web application and I'm able to run that web application also, and I'm able to access that web application in the browser also. Am I doing any server setup? Servers are taken care by Spring Boot. Are we taking care of the servers? Servers are taken care by Spring Boot. Servers are taken care by Spring Boot. That is called embedded servers. Embedded servers. So whenever you develop a web application, whatever the servers are required for your project, servers will be taken care by Spring Boot. Embedded servers. Inbuilt servers are available in the Spring Boot. It is going to provide those servers to run your application. And the next advantage, rapid development. What is the meaning of rapid development? What is the meaning of rapid development, guys? Quick. You can, within fraction of seconds, you can set up your application. Fast development. Development will be faster in the Spring Boot. Why the development is faster in the Spring Boot? Do you need to take care of business logic and configurations, or you need to take care of only your business logic? We need to take care of only business logic. Configurations will be taken care by Spring Boot. Development will be faster when you go for Spring Boot. Another advantage of Spring Boot, actuators. Another advantage of the Spring Boot, actuators. Actuators are used to monitor and manage our application. Now, I have started my application. My application is running. In future, I want to understand what is the health of my application, how many classes loaded by my application, how many threads are running in our application, how many objects are created for our application, what are the URL mappings available for my application. Like this, I want to monitor and manage my application. Spring Boot provided a concept called actuators to monitor and manage our applications. We are going to understand how to work with actuators also. Actuators is one of the powerful concept available in the Spring Boot. Actuators are used to monitor and manage our applications. Actuators are used to monitor and manage our applications. These are the advantages of going for Spring Boot. Right, guys? So can you tell me what is a Spring Boot now? Spring Boot is another approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. Spring Boot is promoting the Spring. Spring Boot is called as enhancement of the Spring. Spring Boot internally uses a Spring framework only. What type of applications we can develop using Spring? Same type of applications can be developed by using Boot also. Spring Boot nothing but existing Spring framework minus XML configurations. From the Spring, if you remove the XML configurations, then it will become Spring Boot. So with the Spring Boot, there are several advantages are available. First one is auto configuration. Second one is form starters. Third one is embedded servers. Fourth one, rapid development. Fifth one, actuators. Actuators are used to monitor and manage our application. Rapid development means development will be faster. Embedded servers, when you develop a web application, Boot providing the servers to run our application, inbuilt servers, in-memory servers. Form starters, nothing but the dependencies that we are configuring. You don't need to configure multiple dependencies. To develop one web application, how many dependencies we have configured? To develop one web application, how many dependencies we configured? To develop a web application, how many dependencies we configured? Just one dependency. To develop a web application, how many dependencies we configured? Just one dependency. It is for test purpose. This is not related to web application. It is common test dependency. So here there is only one dependency. To develop one web application, we have just added one dependency. So POM starters will be available to simplify Maven configuration. Based on the dependencies we have configured, it will perform the configuration required for the project. Boot will identify the configuration required for the project, and Boot is going to provide that configuration. Okay, right. Next one, embedded servers. Embedded servers nothing but the servers which are starting by the Spring Boot to run our web application. Now you see, I am running my web application. When I run my web application, am I deploying this to my server, or it is deployed to embedded server internally? Who has taken care of the deployment? Programmer is taking care of the deployment. Boot is taking care of the deployment. Boot is taking care of the deployment. So that server which is provided by the Spring Boot, this is a Tomcat server which is provided by the Spring Boot to run our application. That server is called as embedded server. The server which is provided by the Spring Boot to run our application, that is called as embedded server. Rapid development. Rapid development means fast development. Actuators are used to monitor and manage our application. So you can monitor health of the application now. Auto configuration means Boot will identify the configuration required for our project and it will provide it. Required for our application and it will provide that configuration. Auto configuration means Spring Boot will identify the configuration required for our application and it will provide that configuration. POM starters are dependencies. POM starters are dependencies that we use to develop our application. To develop our application. Embedded servers. Boot will provide server, web server to run our web application. Those servers are called as embedded servers. You no need to set up a server manually. Boot will provide the servers. Rapid development means fast development. Rapid development means fast development. We can focus only on the business logic. We can focus only on business logic to develop these applications. Actuators are used to monitor and manage our application. Auto configuration means Boot will identify the configurations required for our application and it will provide that configuration. For example, starting IOC container, creating a connection pool. Creating connection pool comes under auto configuration. SMTP creation, SMTP connections, web application deployment, dependency injections, etc. All these things are auto configurations. Programmer no need to specify. These are the default activities that will be taken care by Spring Boot. Auto configuration means Boot will identify the configurations required for our application and it will provide that configurations. Right? Starting IOC container, creating connection pool, creating SMTP connections, deploying web applications into server, dependency injections, everything will be taken care by Boot here. POM starters are nothing but POM starters are nothing but dependencies that we use to develop our application. If you want to develop a application, web application, then we will go for web starter. If you want to develop a web application, then you will go for web starter. Then if you add a web starter, it will provide all the configurations required for the web application. JDBC starter. To communicate with the database, we need a connection pool. Connection pool will be created with this JDBC starter. JDBC starter. Security starter. If you want to secure your application, then there is a starter for that. If you want to send emails from your application, then there is a mail starter. Like this. For every configuration, there is a starter. So these starters are simplified. If you just add this starter, you can develop your web application. If you just add this starter, you can write the security logic for your application. To communicate with the database, you just need to add the JDBC starter. If you want to send emails by using Spring Boot, you just need to take care of this mail starter. Based on the starters you add in the pom.xml, Spring Boot is going to take care of auto configuration. Boot will provide the web servers to run the web applications. Those servers are called as embedded servers. It is providing Tomcat as an embedded server. It is providing Jetty as an embedded server. It is providing Netty as embedded server. That means when you create a web application, Boot is going to provide the servers to run our applications. Those servers are called as embedded servers. Rapid develop, you no need to download and set up the server to run a web application. I have shown you just now. I'm just creating a project by using web starter. Web starter means web application development. It is provided Tomcat as the default embedded server for this. Spring Boot provided Tomcat as a default embedded server to run our application. Tomcat is the default embedded server. Jetty is available. Netty is available. You can change from Tomcat to Jetty. In the coming classes, I will show you how to change from the Tomcat to Jetty. By default, which server is coming when I run web application? By default, Tomcat is coming as a default embedded server. Tomcat is coming as default embedded server. Rapid development means fast development. We can focus only on the business logic because Boot will take care of configurations. Boot will take care of configurations. Actuators are used to monitor and manage our applications. So by using actuator, we can understand how many classes loaded, how many objects created, in our application, how many threads are running, what are the URL mappings available, URL mappings available in our project, health of the project, etc. All these things we can monitor from our application by using actuators. Actuators are used to monitor and manage our application. Actuators providing production ready features for our application. Production ready features for our application. When we deploy our application to the production, then we need to monitor all these things. By using actuators, we are going to monitor all these things. So these are the advantages of going for Spring Boot. So Spring Boot is one approach to develop a Spring application with less configuration. It is enhancement of the Spring. It internally uses a Spring framework only. Auto configuration is one advantage. POM starters, second advantage. Embedded servers, third advantage. Rapid development, fourth advantage. Actuators, fifth advantage. Fine guys, so I have elaborated the advantages of the Spring Boot also. Thanks for joining today. We'll continue again tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Please join with the same Zoom link to attend tomorrow's session. Tomorrow we'll understand some more details related to Spring Boot. Thank you guys. Have a great day.